Okay, great. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon to my fellow colleagues, to church and community leaders, and invited guests from across the United States. Thank you so much for joining me today for our third dialogue in the Uncomfortable Conversation series. My name is Rebecca Simon Peter, and I am a spiritual and leadership coach. I'm passionate about reconnecting church leaders with their God-given powers to co-create miracles with the divine. For more than a decade, I pastored local churches, including an historically Black congregation and small, medium, and large sized churches. I've written several books, most recently, Dream Like Jesus, Deepen Your Faith and Bring the Impossible to Life. And I am the founder of Creating a Culture of Renewal, which is a group coaching program which energizes and empowers church leaders across the country to become visionary leaders in their communities. Now, the Uncomfortable Conversation series was born out of the calls for racial justice that have erupted this summer in the midst of the pandemic in our country and around the globe. And the series was designed to actually engage folks like you, spiritual leaders, in deep listening, heartfelt discussion, mind-expanding conversation so that we can expand our emotional intelligence and to generate renewal during these unprecedented times. I'm very excited about our guest today. Today, we're going to be discussing food deserts, swamps, and pantries, food equity and racial justice. I have two very special guests today, the Reverend Dr. Heber Brown III, who is the pastor of Pleasant Hope Baptist Church in Baltimore and founder of the Black Church Food Security Network. This is a multi-state alliance of historically Black congregations working together to inspire health, wealth, and power, food sovereignty, and the Black community. And also Dr. Marianna Wetherill, who is the Associate Professor at the University of Oklahoma, Health Sciences Center, and a registered dietitian. Her research has involved the design of food as medicine interventions for building nutrition equity among vulnerable populations affected by food insecurity. So, terrific guests. We're going to have a great conversation, and I know that all of you that are here today will be most interested in what we have to say, what is being said, and how you can bring this information back to your ministry settings. So, to both of my guests here, Dr. Wetherill, Reverend Dr. Brown, according to the USDA, 22.5% of African American households and 18.5% of Hispanic households are food insecure. Clearly a big issue. And both of these numbers are significantly higher than the national average of 12.9%. Let's just start right at the beginning. What is food insecurity? How is it different than hunger? Let's begin with Dr. Wetherill.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see everyone. So I actually research food insecurity as my primary area of interest, and a common misperception that a lot of people have is that food insecurity is the same thing as hunger. And hunger is really the most severe form of food insecurity that someone can experience. And in research, we usually call that term very low food security. This can include things like hunger pains, losing weight unintentionally, skipping meals, things of that nature, because there just is not enough resources to eat in the household. But there's also other dimensions of food insecurity that can still affect mental health and physical health that may not necessarily include hunger. And so this can include just worrying about not having enough food to eat, as well as maybe eating less expensive types of food to make sure there's enough to fill a stomach, but that really is not going to be helpful in the long run for health. So we really should be thinking about food insecurity as a spectrum of risk, and thinking about the ways we can respond to it in different ways.
That's good. Reverend Dr. Brown, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. I'd say that looking at, I love where you ended, the spectrum of risks, that certainly can be found on an individual level. The way that our organization, the Black Church Food Security Network, engages that spectrum is probably more so at the systemic level than the individual level. So certainly we have cooking demonstrations and those kinds of activities that happen that help individuals and individual households. But we also are sensitive to the ways in which society is structured to make it difficult for those on that spectrum to achieve the resources that they need for themselves and their families to be food secure, or their communities to be food secure, recognizing that those dynamics didn't just materialize out of thin air. A socio-political lens is also important.
Boy, isn't that the truth? And so how does that relate to food deserts and a term that was new to me, food swamps? How's that all related with the systemic nature and the food insecurity? Reverend Dr. Brown, what would you say about that?
Sure, I would first put those terms on the witness stand. Let's interrogate them. I would ask, where did these words come from?
Okay.
The source of them, who created them? Many of us are familiar with terms like food desert. And if your experience is like mine, just one day it just started popping up everywhere and everybody started using this term. And then we found out that you can get grant money for using that term. So you put it all in the grants and say, listen, we're addressing food deserts, without really getting to the root of where that word comes from. And so the USDA is oftentimes pointed to as a source for defining that term. But as many people on this screen, and let me just say that, so food desert has, and there's many other people on the screen who could speak to this as well, but it will involve looking at the socioeconomic realities of a community. It can involve looking at the distance between, or the distance from grocery stores, if that's like 2 miles or more, if there are transportation issues, lack of car ownership, all those kinds of things can come into play when it comes to defining and describing what a food desert is. But I like to interrogate the term, because if that's our starting point for getting at hunger issues and food insecurity issues, I venture to say it has some pretty big blind spots. And as people of faith, many people of faith and conscience who are watching this, many of us are familiar with the theology of abundance.
Yes.
But what happens when your starting point for engaging hunger and food insecurity really springs from deficiency and lack? I venture to say that that's not a sustainable fuel for the marathon that is engaging the spectrum with respect to food insecurity. And it really can dishonor the people who live in the communities that are being described. We overlook the resources and the assets that are there. And instead of embracing that question that God asked Moses in Exodus chapter 4, what do you have in your hand? We actually flip it and start with, what doesn't this community have that I can come in and save the day for it? So I challenge the notion of food desert and food swamps. Even as I understand what those terms are trying to get at, I'd rather bend my ear to those who live in those neighborhoods to tell us and define the dynamics that they're living in.
So we've got those terms on the witness stand. What terms would you use? What do you suggest? What is going to be a more empowering approach that honors the people in the communities and describes the situation at hand?
So 2 terms come to mind, and I got to first tip my hat to a dynamic woman named Karen Washington, who is the co-founder of Bugs, Black Urban Growers. I know you all will appreciate her organization and her wisdom. She lifted up this term a couple of years back called food apartheid. When I first heard it, I clutched my imaginary pearls and had to take a moment, because I've never heard the word apartheid attached to the word food before. But then she explains and says food apartheid because it allows for more room to look at the layers of challenges and conditions on that spectrum we just heard about, from social, economic, faith, gender, go on down the line. And when that lens is wider and we understand what's contributing to the spectrum at a more holistic level, then it can help us to be more imaginative and innovative about how we engage the challenge. And so she offers up food apartheid. And let me just say too, it gives me pause, right? And I think it should. I think that in a country of such great wealth and resources, and in the world, a global environment as well, where this country has a whole lot of resources, I think it should give us pause when we can have obesity and severe hunger and malnourishment in the same picture. Something is wrong there, right? And so I actually like the term because unlike food desert, it's a term that halts me in my tracks. Stop, think, consider, and lean into, as my Jesuit sisters and brothers would say, lean into the discomfort of that term and that dynamic in reality. And so I like it for that reason. And can I just say, deserts didn't do nothing to nobody. Deserts are part of the natural landscape of this wonderful tapestry of creation. And so for those who have eyes to see it, there's a whole lot of life in the desert. And so I think, on that end, it's troubling as well in terms of food desert. I'll say this quickly and shut down. Y'all know I'm a Baptist preacher. I can preach a sermon any day of the week. But I'll say the other term that I've really embraced, and it's really a North Star for our organization, is food sovereignty. Food sovereignty.
Yeah.
And there's an organization called La Via Campesina, an international farmers and landowners and peasant farmer organization that really lifts food sovereignty up as the goal. And when you look up that definition, it has to do more with rights and people having the right to define, to shape, and to lead in the creation of their own food environment. It has to do with centering farmers and families instead of markets and corporations. It's a powerful term, but that is where we really get a lot of our strength and our. And I know that in many indigenous communities, food sovereignty is also a powerful term and concept as well. And so those are terms that we feel like better honor the agency, assets, and resources and dignity of local communities that are impacted by what I'll say is the violence of poverty and the violence of food insecurity as well.
That was all very well said. And this is called Uncomfortable Conversations. And when I first heard food apartheid, I was very uncomfortable with it. I'm born and raised Jewish, and when people throw the word Holocaust around, I think, well, now let's just pause here for a second. I feel the same way around the word apartheid because it has a definite experience for people. And does it cheapen things? But I'm hearing you what you're saying, and we are having uncomfortable conversations. And I like the idea of using some new terms that focus on assets and the lived experience of people in those communities. And it's a great segue to talk with Dr. Wetherill about food sovereignty, because you work in Oklahoma and you've studied native populations help me with the tribes, where food sovereignty is a very important concept.
Yeah, so I've actually had the great blessing to be able to work both with Choctaw Nation and Chickasaw Nation on several interventions as a co-investigator. I didn't lead the studies. I was just part of the helping team the tribes did so much of the work themselves, which really speaks to the importance of honoring the community and the strength within a community to help solve their own problems. They know the solution that will work. And so very much we want to recognize, these things do not happen overnight, and what were those systemic inequities that caused that disadvantage to occur, and then really get more back to reclaiming the fundamental things that are necessary for food security to occur in a community. And it's true for any population, and whether you're in a rural area, an urban area, just really listening to that lived history and working with the groups of people who are being impacted to be able to affect that kind of change. And I would just add that yes, we do know that food deserts as well as food swamps clearly are linked to health inequities. But just to kind of add on to this conversation, there have been many interventions that have tried to install a grocery store into these areas, and surprisingly, it doesn't really seem to make that kind of an impact. And so my reasoning for why that may be is because we're not actually addressing the root of the problem, and that is the need for people who are affected by food insecurity to be able to reclaim their own power.
Mm. Reclaim their own power. Well, so how do you do that? What are some of the solutions that are out there? And I know, Dr. Wetherill, you've worked a lot with food pantries and studied them in Oklahoma. Are they part of the problem? Are they part of the solution? What's the role of food pantries in all of this? And I know our church leaders are listening because so many churches and church-based organizations, we focus on feeding people and how can we get the most amount of food to people, especially in the time of COVID. So help us understand if we're part of the problem or part of the solution.
Yeah, so it all goes back to historical understanding, right? And we need to first recognize that food pantries were founded for a reason. They were founded as part of an emergency food response system, and they played a necessary role. But as societal needs have shifted, we no longer see people presenting with emergency food needs, right? Food pantries have become part of the fabric of food resources on a monthly to semi-monthly basis for many people, in particular, people who are living in areas that have no other places to access food. So food pantries play a very vital role in the food environment for many communities, but I would challenge people and organizations who are leading food pantries to step back and think, what additional things can I do to help facilitate long-term change? And there are a number of approaches that can be used, and I'm more than happy to discuss various options, but there has to be some way of listening to clients who are accessing the food and working to implement long-term solutions with them as partners rather than as food recipients would be my summary statement there.
Okay, because we are going to want to know some solutions here. Because if we think we're part of the problem, it's not going to sit too well to just think, well, I'm part of the problem, but I don't know what else to do. So let's talk solutions. And I know, Reverend Dr. Brown, you have some solutions that you guys have been working on. Tell us about the Black Church Food Security Network. What is that? How does it work?
Sure. So, like many other places, Baltimore is filled with organizations that are doing very hard work and noble work in trying to address issues of hunger and food insecurity. And one of the things that we recognize and that I recognized as a pastor was that many of the hospital visits I was making in extending pastoral care were to people in my church who were going in and out of the hospital for diet-related issues and challenges. Y'all know it. We give prayer, we give scripture, we give encouragement. But when you start seeing the same people, and then for those of us who pastored, or I see bishops on the line as well, over some time, you start seeing different lines of the same family challenged by the same issues. And so I just figured that there was something more I could do in addition to prayer and scripture to address the systemic issues related to why people in my church were not able to get access to nutrient-rich food at a level that they needed and wanted. And initially, I was going to establish a partnership with a local fresh food market. The prices were crazy. I couldn't do it. And so instead of going that route, I had a moment of divine discontent where God put my eyes on a little piece of the front yard that our church wasn't using. And that's when we started growing food on our own land, only 1,500 square feet. But I tell you, the Lord of the harvest has been amazing in these 10 years that we've been growing to now produce 1,200 pounds of produce each year on just 1,500 square feet. Why? In large part because we got people in my church who are from the South, grew up in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee. When they came north in the Great Migration, though they left the farm, farming didn't leave them. And I had been overlooking them in my congregation because if you can't sing, if you can't keep the beat on the drum, if you can't stand on the wall like an usher, I don't know what to do with you, because traditional church ministry says these are the lanes for service. But what do you do when people in your church are herbalists? What do you do when they can can peaches and tomatoes? What do you do when they know how to grow food? So God instigated these thoughts in me. We started to grow food. Our church started having an amazing experience with growing our own food. the pews started to fill up a little bit more. And I thought it was because, people were finally recognizing my amazing gifts as a preacher. But no, it was broccoli and kale and cauliflower and all that other stuff, right? And so I started to think, let's swim upstream a little bit. What would happen if you can get multiple churches growing food on their own land and utilizing their church kitchen, their church van, their fellowship hall and multipurpose room to engage the issue of food insecurity from a systemic way? Because I didn't just want to help individual churches, but actually have the churches working together to engage the food system. So that's what we started to do in 2015, in the middle of the Baltimore uprising, after the death of Freddie Gray at the hands of Baltimore City police officers. While the city was up in open rebellion, our phone started ringing. People started calling us and saying, we need food. The corner store shut down. The grocery store left town. And our calling card was food. And so I called other Black farmers and churches that I knew, and we pieced together this network that still exists to this day and now is across so much of the East Coast and now in the Midwest as well. Two things, maybe three, and I'll shut down. One, we help Black churches grow food on their land. Two, we bring a miniature farmers market inside the church. 6 to 8 vendors, that's it. All of them sell out in a fraction of the time that they spend at the big one downtown, the big farmers market downtown. Three, this is hot off the press, y'all. Y'all just getting this. We launched this month something called the BCSA. Many of you are familiar with CSAs. We launched a BCSA, Black Church Supported Agriculture, where we buy from Black farmers in the South, work with them, even rent trucks if we need to truck that produce and meat that's sustainably grown into Baltimore, and then we move it to churches around our area. Many of the churches that are doing food distribution right now are getting their food from farmers or from corporations. And I'm going to be very hesitant to say food pantries should stop, cut it out. I'm going to be hesitant to do that. But I won't miss the opportunity to say it's no long-term solution. There's a hole in the bottom of that bucket. And so what we started to do was to say to churches, listen, I'm glad you're giving out food right now in COVID. How about you buy it from Black farmers who are not getting USDA contracts, who are not a part of the economic loop of, helping themselves and their families. Buy it from them and then give it to your community. Same thing, but put a economic justice motive to that great work that you're doing. That's called the BCSA. And so there's just a few things that we're doing, but really it boils down to what some call asset-based community development, starting with what Black churches already have, and I'll speak a word about Black in a minute. Black churches already have, and bringing it together more strategically. Why should it sit there Monday through Saturday underutilized or completely unutilized? I think that's a shame before God, that God blesses us with all this land and it sits there looking pretty in a time of a global pandemic. Let's put it to work and make it a partner in our ministry. We focus on Black, promise last thing. We focus on the African-American church community because in Baltimore and in many other urban centers in the country, Black folks are disproportionately impacted. That's where you started, Rev, that, Black people are disproportionately impacted. And I feel like those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And what the Black church allows for is, and has since the late 1700s, a bastion for support and love and power and economic support and community organizing. I mean, think about your favorite civil rights leaders. Many of them were shaped and molded and mentored in Black church spaces. So while my context is the Black church, yours might be a different context, but I pray that there's some transferable wisdom to your context, and we begin to see our churches as institutional anchors to engage the underlying power dynamics and economic situation of those who are facing hunger and food insecurity in your community.
That's really great what you said about those that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. That's a very empowering lens through which to look at it instead of, oh, those poor people. We got to fix them, we got to save them, we got to help them. It was interesting what you said, Dr. Wetherill, intervention of bringing in a grocery store, and that still didn't do it. So it's not about something that's missing from the outside, it's about something that's not tapped from the inside. And you said, Dr. Brown, Reverend Dr. Brown, your personal motto has been critique what is and create what should be. Let's take that. I mean, that's such a great empowering way to look at things. And given your research, Dr. Wetherill, and what you know about what's going on in Oklahoma, we've got nations there, we've got the African American community finding ways to empower itself. What can we do? How can we take that motto, critique what is, create what should be, and those closest to the problem are also closest to the solution? What do you see? What can we do, Dr. Wetherill? What can we do around food pantries? How can we apply those concepts, do you suppose?
Well, I think it's important that we all recognize that, resources do vary and readiness varies. And, some communities may have a number of people who are ready to mobilize and, tackle the solution. And other communities might actually first need to develop that infrastructure framework first to even explore what the problem is and how to best resolve it. So I think that needs to be the first step that everyone can take, is kind of gauge where is my church at? Do we already have a good history of tackling other social justice issues where we can maybe follow similar models, or have we never done anything like this? And maybe need some guidance on how to move forward, and also just doing some introspection on what are we doing now, and what is the message that we're sending through what we are doing now. And a common example that I use is a traditional food pantry model. So we've seen it on the news, all of the drive-through food box distributions that are happening. And also this happens in very small, churches before COVID, where people walk up to a pantry and they're given a bag of food and expected to be happy with it and leave. And if they're not happy with it, well, then they weren't hungry enough. Those kinds of opinions. And that can be, very dehumanizing. So stepping back and saying, is the model of help that I am offering one that empowers people, or is this one that further oppresses them? And doing some soul searching there. And I think that, growing food, offering economic resources for selling food, all of that is excellent. For churches that aren't ready to tackle that, they could certainly consider changing their traditional food pantry model to at least a semi-choice model or a full choice model, where people can at least have the opportunity to pick what food is best for them. And they know best what their children need. They know best what their household members need. And there are many tools and resources for how to convert a traditional pantry to at least a full choice pantry, which restores some autonomy. And then if there are more resources and more people who want to do more transformative change, go for it. That's great. But how can we move things into a way that more honors the dignity of human beings?
Yeah, such a great question. We've got really good stuff coming up in the chat window. Let's just take a look and see what's happening here. I like your idea of full choice. I've even heard about food pantries. Well, people moving from the pantry model to the grocery store model. It's free. Come in, get your items, come, I don't know if you can go through a checkout line, exactly how that works, but do you know more about that?
Yes, there's several ways to do a choice model. I think even small food pantries. I worked for 10 years actually as a dietitian for an organization that ran a very small food pantry that actually used a choice model, where people could go through and select the foods that they knew that they needed, and they were able to effectively spend about $40. There's no money exchange, but $40 value was what they were able to select from that pantry. And that was a very small space that looked almost like a mom and pop grocery store that we set up. But you can also scale that model to, serving hundreds and hundreds of people in a month's time, and have many people going through. But yes, the more that you can restore people's ability to choose, is going to be best for not only their mental, emotional well-being, but also their physical well-being. Because when people are given the option, most of the time they will choose what's best for their health.
Huh, imagine that. Yeah, that's cool. And I've also heard about soup kitchens moving to a restaurant model. And so there's all kinds of ways to take it out of us versus them, we're in it together, serving people. So let's just go to the chat window a little bit, see what's happening over here. Ernie Farah in New England was talking about, I was told we were going to ruin the church with a garden in front instead of a lawn. Yet we are so attached to our lawns. Speaking to my church about using the property, Russell says, we own around the facilities for community development. There is a gardening movement, Marty Stebbins says, that mixes veggies into large flower beds. Okay, so you get to have the best of both worlds. A core part of the challenge as people of faith is that food pantries can be a way of maintaining an us versus them ministry that is done to others instead of being in ministry with. And then we've got Kelvin Garvanne, Public Policy Research, City of Los Angeles, Board of Public Works, focused on reducing food insecurity and food waste. Excellent, excellent. Yeah, very good. Nice to see you. Thank you for being here. We've got someone else commenting. Tiny pantry is full choice. I find folks don't take as much food as we would have given when we chose. That's interesting, but they took what they wanted, right? They took what they needed. Good, do we have any questions, any specific questions for our terrific panelists here? Dr. Wetherill, Reverend Dr. Brown, any specific questions that they might answer? Yes, Kelvin.
I was on another meeting. I'm sorry to be late. I respect everyone's time and time zone. Something that Marianna said during her explanation made me think of something that I just learned here in Los Angeles. I read this book called The Deepest Well by the California Surgeon General, Nadine Burke Harris. And within her book, The Deepest Well, she discusses that a lot of people don't want healthy food. They need food that is high fat and high sugar content because they're under toxic stress and their systems are responding to fight or flight. And what I'm noticing here in Los Angeles is there's a lot of what I almost call food gentrification. People are getting turnips, butternut squash, things that they might not necessarily normally eat. But then I'm seeing, as I just go through the city, half-used boxes of things which it seems like have been gone through. And the requirement internally of looking at providing for folks what is perhaps seasonal or what can actually be moved to their area of use by a more efficient food supply chain, but then finally being aware of there's just things that people don't want. In her book, she mentioned on page 72 that some people don't want broccoli, they want French fries. Mm-hmm. So addressing this notion of toxic stress and the hormones that impact what someone wants, I think that that's an area which I'm going more toward in looking at how to solve this issue of insecurity and appetite, how to satiate an appetite. I don't know if anyone wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I definitely can speak on that. I could probably talk for a whole hour on that, so I might go on a little bit of a tangent here. But I think it's really important that we all recognize that food insecurity, particularly in households with children, is an adverse child experience. It is a trauma, and that can perpetuate other things into adulthood, which predispose people to food insecurity. So it is very important that we think about trauma-informed care whenever we're serving populations who are affected with food insecurity. There's actually a researcher named Marianna Chilton, so she spells her first name like mine, just with one N, and she's done intervention work with food insecure women and found that if you just do trauma intervention, don't even focus on giving them food, their food security gets better. So really focusing on the social, spiritual safety and resilience building can actually allow people to internally work through what may be in the way of their own food security, at least from an individual level. And yes, recognizing that we all like to use sugar and fat to make us feel better. It's just whenever the stressors are so high, that does become a habitualized behavior. And the other struggle with that is for people who have grown up in areas, that we have, called food swamps and talked about the issues of using that term, but where abundant food that's processed food is the norm, it can be really hard to want to eat broccoli and to know how to prepare it and all of those things. And so it's not that you can educate people and make them be food secure, but it has to be part of a holistic approach of reclaiming healthful food in a way that will serve us for our well-being. Another comment, in addition to the food, is the very high rates of tobacco use among people who live with food insecurity. It's about 50%, most studies suggest. And it's very easy to quickly judge and say, oh, well, if they quit smoking, they wouldn't be food insecure. I've heard that said many times, but we need to recognize that, cigarettes also serve a purpose. They are a way to cope with stress. And our own research has found that people also are using cigarettes to physically suppress their hunger pains. So, you have to, again, go back and see what's causing these behaviors to occur and address the root cause to be able to help more holistic healing.
Yeah. Boy, that's so good. Last month on the Uncomfortable Conversations, we talked about health disparities and health inequities. And we talked about the stress, the physical stress of racism. And we didn't talk about poverty per se, but just the physical stress of poverty. And so interesting, Kelvin, for you to bring that to our attention, and Dr. Wetherill, for you to affirm these findings, and also about cigarettes. It's very, very interesting to think about that. We have another question that's come in from Bishop Shelley Bryan Wee to address Dr. Brown's message. Is there a place on the internet where there's a list of Black and/or people of color farmers in order to work with them? She's in the Seattle area.
Yeah, I think that a good organization to check out, Bishop, is Green the Church. I would go there. Check with Green the Church and my good friend, Reverend Ambrose Carroll at greenthechurch.org. They don't just focus on food security, but they also look at climate change and things that individual places of worship can do, a whole range of things. But they are based, if I'm not mistaken, in the Oakland area. And so their database is going to be more so on the west. Ours is more so on the east. But I got a hunch we're going to meet in the middle real soon, given the attention and focus on food and the like. But I would start there. I would also say, though, that our website does start, just in case you got some cousins on the East Coast, you can go to blackchurchfoodsecurity.net. We have a Black farmer directory, and we're working every day to get more and more Black farmers to get on our GIS maps. You can look up their website, find out what they got going, and support them as well.
Very interesting. We've had a question, is there a teaching part to your ministries? Ernie in New England is wanting to help people to garden, raise beds, small spaces, could use in the urban areas as well as the rural areas. Do you teach people how to grow? Is that part of what you do, Dr. Brown?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, there's a number of opportunities that we have either at our markets, way back in the day when our congregations could gather in person. we had these soil to sanctuary markets that we also put food demonstrations experiences in the church kitchen while the market is going on, right? And so like for one of them, we had one of the children of our community, Naima, 12-year-old child cooking champion in our area. She did a demo on vegetarian black bean meal, and people loved it. And another class that we did was one of the mothers of our community did a session on how to make fast, nutrient-rich lunches for your children. What we found was lifting up the wisdom of the people already in the building and already in our community was far more effective than calling in some expert who's outside of the community to tell us how bad we're eating, how wrong everything is. Like, we got to be honest, food is a deeply emotional thing as well, right? I think about macaroni and cheese to this day because my big mama, Mama Geraldine, is up in heaven right now making it, because I know God wanted some for God's self. And so, but when I eat macaroni and cheese, I think about my big mama. I think about my grandmother. It's deeply relational. So think about this. When we try to snatch plates away from people, when we demonize and when we yuck the yum of people that we're in community with, you're not just saying don't eat that. You're making a comment about their relationships with people that they love, respect, cherish, and share life with. So that is why I believe that for those of you on the screen, we really are in a perfect position. Most of us are in faith communities of some kind or connected to one. Because in faith communities, I believe that the soil is cultivated to a degree, and there's a depth of relationship where we can have these conversations and work together on interventions, if you want to call it that, but to work together on them, as opposed to let's call somebody in to completely wipe out any sense of self-worth and agency that we thought we had in our little community.
I'm reminded of the studies that have been done of the French and the Italian who lived long lives, you know, drinking wine, eating high-fat foods, all the stuff that's unhealthy, and just beautiful lives. They're surrounded by family and friends, and they actually sit down to eat. So it's not really, now, I know Dr. Wetherill is actually a registered dietitian, so I may be going against the norms here, but it has so much to do with context, right? The love that you're talking about, Reverend Dr. Brown, it's context, it's love, it's connection, it's family. Is there a way for us to have it all, you know, from the ground up? So what does the research say about that, Dr. Wetherill?
Well, I think it does go back to, you know, what's the use of the food. And I think about what Kelvin said, you know, in the context of, you know, a satisfying meal that, you know, is maybe enjoyed with others and there's not the toxic stress around it. You're not really using food to cope with, you know, something that is not fulfilled in your life. You're using it more as a social medium, and you're less likely to be overeating it and to use it where it becomes detrimental. And so I do wholeheartedly agree that we don't want to shame anyone for foods that are part of their cultural identity or their family heritage. And my goal is more about letting people know what options there are, finding things that are acceptable and enjoyable for them, and also just giving them an opportunity to think critically about what food rules mean in their community and in their families, how they came to be, and what role do they want to play, if any, in changing them.
So great. Yeah, I'm born and raised Jewish. You cannot convince me that gefilte fish and horseradish doesn't taste delicious. You just can't convince me of that. You don't have to eat it, but I want to eat it at least once a year. So I get that about food being so personal and connected to family and events and rituals and faith and all of that. Super important. Hey, it's been a great conversation so far. Let's see if we've got any other questions from our guests here today. Any other questions? Got some good conversation going on in the chat window. People are empowering each other. Okay, Marty Stebbins. And I think it's Bishop Marty Stebbins, isn't it? Reverend Brown points out that food is ultimately cultural. We can increase people's nutrition within the culture that they reside. The challenge will be how to increase our physical activity. There's that too, a topic for another day. Yeah, yeah, good. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Kelvin.
I've been following some of the farmers markets here in Los Angeles that are managed by SELA. And what I'm noticing is the quality of the food. And here in 2020, I'm noticing that the actual quality of food that is in the supply chain coming from local farms is better quality. So there might be people who are shopping from a market that goes through the process of going from a farm in Fresno to either the Bay Area or Los Angeles, and then goes back to them. It's been in this supply chain. It's gotten into the supply chain where it's not actually ripened or it's been sprayed or colored or whatever. The kind of food people are getting is not optimal. I'm starting to talk more about food that optimizes health and well-being. And if I think what I'm wanting to try to implement is farmers markets plus one. So like industry wanting to do China plus one for their procurement, if individuals who are getting subsidized food already or having the ability to get food subsidized through EBT, SNAP, et cetera, if they're getting optimal food through local supply chains, they will actually have a opportunity to get food that's more vibrant, food that is actually more healthy. And yes, if we do more exercise, it'll help our health. But I think that the quality of the food is a consideration, and the local farmers and the people who are doing urban agriculture projects are really helping forward that so that people are getting things that are fit to eat. And eating to live, eating fit food is increasingly important because a lot of this food that's moving around has been moving around too long, and the quality of it is definitely something that isn't transparent, and there isn't any real accountability for it.
Any responses to that? Dr. Brown, Dr. Wetherill?
Well, it just made me think about the value of what Reverend Brown is doing and bringing the farmers markets into the church and supporting Black owned farm operations is very important. We found in our own research in Oklahoma that one of the biggest barriers to farmers market participation among African American women with young children was that they did not feel welcome. They felt like a farmer's market was for wealthy white women, and that they would not be looked, pleasantly by going there or bringing their children or using their SNAP benefits, their food stamp benefits, even though the farmer's market accepted SNAP. So, really thinking about what are these hidden rules and perceptions, and making sure again that the solution's resting with the community and we're providing options that are acceptable.
That's interesting. In my work with creating, I'm sorry, did I cut somebody off?
I was going to say very quickly, Doc, you're a walking encyclopedia of research. I love it. You're just pulling it right on top of your head. It's beautiful. I'm going to be like you one day. But I think what you're saying is so on point. I remember I went to a farmer's market some years ago when I'd never been to before. And when I went to the farmer's market, I walked, very popular farmer's market. There was like a banjo playing, like somebody was playing a banjo, and they were like doing like that. I don't even know the style of the dance, like when they have the thick heels on and like clicking the heels and stuff like that. And immediately I said, oh, this is not for me. I'm not saying it's not for you. I'm just saying this was not playing with me in mind. And so how many of us have been to meetings back in the day when we could see each other in person, when there was food being ordered or delivered for the event, right? Do you know given the depth of food and what it means, do you know that we're sending messages to people even by the food that we're having on the table at our events? And there have been events that I've gone to. I walk in the door before the event begins. I look at the cheese and the crackers and the grapes on the table after a long day where I'm hungry. And I realize in that moment, I have to text my wife and say, babe, can you please put something together? Because he's not going to hold me. I'll just say, I may be freezing up here, but let me just say that having mentors beyond the circle of your contextual experience, especially when you're talking about engaging with these communities, is very important. Your church might need a mentor, you know, and so I love what you said, Doc, earlier about evaluating and doing some introspection on where you are and engaging. So maybe a book club is where you are, right? I would put out there books like Dr. Monica White's book called Freedom Farmers. It's a wonderful text, short book, but it's wonderful. It talks about the history of African Americans in agriculture, farming, and food that used it as a form of resistance against racism and societal oppression. Beautiful book. Another one, Andy Fisher has a book called Big Hunger for all our food pantry folks. Great text. Y'all, I didn't write the books. I'm not getting a kickback. These are just good books that have helped me in my journey. Maybe that's where you are, book club, and that's cool. Maybe having a congregational mentor, that church cross town, that pastor down the street, that community organization perhaps, but getting some accountability to what you're doing. People who are not afraid to say, hey, that thing y'all did, don't do it no more because it sent this message. I know you didn't mean it, but this is the impact that it had in that community. It's very important. And so I'll go back finally just to like power dynamics, evaluating power dynamics of society, of our churches. Super important that we look at not just the what, but the why. Why is the community struggling with food insecurity? And then when you do some studies on the history of redlining in your community, you might find that the redlining map for your city or for your community overlays well with the food insecurity map. That the ripple effect of gentrification, the ripple effect of housing discrimination still comes to us today, even if we don't bring those terms up because it's impolite conversation now. But thankfully we have uncomfortable conversations where we can bring it up. But those types of things can be very helpful. It can save you time, money, aggravation, and connect you with those who are closer to the source of what it is whatever it is you're trying to engage as a community.
Very good. Dr. Wetherill, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think he said it all. The only little comment I would give is that for those of you who might be, writing a grant to help inform this work, actually do some financial capacity building, do not forget to write in stipends for the stakeholders that will be advising you. So if we want you to consult with the community, so recognize them for their wisdom and pay them as experts, whether that's, a couple $100 stipend or $50 a meeting or something along those lines. That's a really important gesture to give and to recognize for the value that they're actually going to be bringing to your project.
That's beautiful. That's great. Well, in the redlining, I'd like to just look forward a month with you folks, if I may. Next month for our Uncomfortable Conversation series, we're going to be talking about voting and redlining. And so that's so important when we're addressing systemic racism. And so interesting comment for us to look towards, do those red lines correlate with food insecurity, et cetera? Really good. Boy, it's been a terrific conversation today. I appreciate everybody who's been here. We've got some terrific comments still in the chat window. But as we kind of wrap this up, I want to give each of you, Dr. Wetherill, Reverend Dr. Brown, just a minute, 45 seconds to give us your final shot. What can church leaders do? Give us 2 tips. What can church leaders do to upgrade the experience the ministry and the impact of working with food insecure folks to create food sovereignty. What's your final word to us? We'll start with Reverend Dr. Brown, then we'll go over to Dr. Wetherill, and then I'll have a thank you, and we'll be done for this hour.
Thank you so much. I'm putting my timer on so I can make sure I do 45 seconds.
Okay.
So look, to get all of you together on a Monday is a miracle in itself. I know what Mondays mean to people of faith. I'll just say this. There's an amazing window of opportunity right now for the church to take prophetic and righteous risks for justice sake. It's an amazing opportunity. Why? People are going to give us so much room and grace right now because they're just so glad you got a Zoom going. They're just so glad we're doing what we can to help our community. And people are not going to pop your hand as much. And I know about getting my hand popped in the congregation, but they're not going to pop it as much because we're so hungry to be together in whatever form that comes. With that in mind, I would encourage us to take some risks for righteousness and for justice. We can't read Genesis through Revelation and all the risks that we're taking to address issues at the root cause and play it safe right now. And I get playing it safe. I get it, all the challenges there. I got children, I got a wife, I got a family. I get all that. But here's a chance, y'all, that may not come, hopefully don't come, again in our lifetime. So on that justice effort, root causes, engaging power dynamics, lifting up the mirror and looking at your own privilege and power and interrogating it to see what is the blind spot and what is getting in the way of addressing this issue so that people can care for themselves. Last thing I promise, we can't empower anyone. We can't. You can't empower somebody, but we can honor the power that people already have that God gave them. And we can be wind to the sails of what people have already figured out for themselves. And if we get in that position, I believe it goes a heck of a long way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Dr. Wetherill.
Well, it's really hard to follow Reverend Brown, but I would just remind everyone that to not fall in the trap of coming up with the solution for others. So we've come up with a lot of great ideas, but my challenge for everyone is to, as a first priority, set a goal to engage with the people that you are currently serving through food programs and create an infrastructure for them to have a participatory dialogue with you and allow yourself to do far more listening than talking and explore potential solutions together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very, very much. And before we end today's Uncomfortable Conversation series, I want to thank each and every one of you for your participation, to all of our guests for showing up on a Monday. And as Reverend Dr. Brown said, we know what Monday means in the life of faith. You really made this an exciting hour. And Dr. Wetherill, Reverend Dr. Brown, you two really brought it to us. And thank you so much for your wisdom, for your research, for your passion, for your knowledge, and for challenging us in this uncomfortable conversation. You did us justice. This was perfect. Thank you so much for being here today. And we will reconvene in a month to discuss voting rights, redlining, and all things related to elections. So thank you so much for being here, and bless you, and be bold. Be bold out there. This is the moment. This is the time. Thank you so much.